In this video, I will discuss the basics of raw image developing. I'll be discussing the basic sliders used in Lightroom. There are many software programs for processing images. Most of the programs will have corresponding sliders or adjustment tools that perform the same functions as the ones I'll show you here. When using a different program, you will just need to find the corresponding tool in the program of your choice. This is by no means a comprehensive video. It will cover the basics using a landscape image. When developing portraits and wildlife, the tools will work the same. However, you will need to use them to differing degrees to get a good result. As an example, most of the time you will not add as much sharpness or contrast to a portrait image. Post-processing consists of 4 main steps. The first step is developing the raw image. The second step would be exposure blending if it's required. The third step is adjusting contrast, making color changes, or adjusting the detail and texture of the image. And the final step would be selective sharpening and noise reduction. The basic raw development of an image will be similar no matter which software you use. These are the basic sliders in Lightroom Classic. Most other raw processing software will have similar sliders and adjustment tools. I will explain what each slider does in Lightroom Classic so that you can find the similar tool in the software of your choice. We will be using this example as we go through the sliders. I will explain what each slider does, and you will see how it affects the raw image. During raw processing, we want to address the following. We want to correct any lens distortion and chromatic aberration. We want to balance the lights and the darks in the image and add a bit of vibrance if it's needed. After adjusting for chromatic aberration and lens distortion, the next thing that we do is adjust for the exposure of the image. Now, the exposure slider simply brightens or darkens the entire image equally. Now that we've decided which exposure we're going to edit, the first thing I do when I go into Lightroom is I choose the lens correction tab and I click off the chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Lightroom has a really good database of lenses, and generally it picks up the lens that I've used and automatically adjusts both of those things correctly. If you click on the eyeball, you will notice the changes that it has made to correct for the lens distortion, and usually it works very well, and I just leave it as is. So once that's done, I will go back to the basic tab and then adjust for exposure. Now I make sure that this little highlight in the corner of our histogram is checked off, and I will bring up the exposure until the foreground exposure or the dark areas are as bright as I want them, or the highlights start to get blown out, whichever comes first. So I'm just going to start bringing up this exposure and we'll see where we go, where it gets. So, oh, look, I've blown out some highlights. You can see them right here in red. If you click on this exposure slider and click Alt at the same time, you will see a black screen with bright colored areas. Now those bright colored areas are the areas that you've blown up by bringing up the exposure. So I then take the exposure back down until there's nothing blown out and my little triangle has nothing in it anymore. According to the famous landscape photographer Ansel Adams, each image should have a point of true black and a point of true white. This ensures the image will cover a broad dynamic range, which prevents the image from looking flat. The black slider controls the darkest areas of an image, including the black point. Changes in the black slider are global, affecting the entire image. It is used to control the amount of an image that is pure black and devoid of detail. The white slider changes the overall brightness of an image, including the white point. Changes in the white slider are also global, affecting the entire image. It is used to control the amount of an image that is pure white and devoid of detail. Blacks and whites should be set prior to changing highlights and shadows. The white sliders set the white point. The white point is the absolute brightest pixel in the image. Moving the slider to the right increases the brighter areas and the amount of the photo that is pure white. Moving the slider to the left makes the brighter areas darker and decreases the amount of the image that is pure white. Adjusting the whites adjusts the brightness of the entire image and covers a much wider range than the highlights. The black slider sets the black point in an image. Moving the slider to the right makes the darks of the image brighter and decreases the area in the image that is pure black, and moving the slider to the left makes the darks darker and increases the amount of the image that is pure black. Adjusting the blacks adjusts the darkness of the entire image and covers a wider range than when you're adjusting the shadows. So now that we've adjusted our exposure, it's time to set our white and our black points. I do this by alt-clicking this white slider and dragging the slider up until I see blown out colors, and I take it just below that. I do the same with the blacks. I click on Alt and move the black slider until I see a little bit of black coming through. I like to have some pure blacks in my images. It just makes the image look richer and the shadows look correct. So about that much is probably okay. Highlights are the brightest parts of the image that still have some detail and are not pure white. The highlights slider is designed to bring back detail into the brightest areas of the image or to brighten the highlights while protecting against clipping. The highlight slider can still cause areas to be clipped, but it requires a stronger adjustment than when using the white slider. Clipping the highlights is when the highlight becomes so bright that there is no longer any detail. Moving the slider to the right makes the brights brighter. Moving the slider to the left makes the brights darker. The highlight slider works within a more targeted area, whereas the white slider will adjust the entire image. Increase the highlights 100% will not create as much pure white in your image as increasing the white point 100%. The shadows slider adjusts just the darker parts of the image that still have some detail. The shadows slider is designed to bring back detail in the darkest areas of the image or to create more shadowed areas while protecting against crushing the blacks. The shadows slider can still cause crushing of the blacks, but it requires a stronger adjustment than when using the blacks slider. Crushing the blacks is when the shadows get so dark that they become pure black and contain no visible detail. Moving the slider to the right makes the darker areas brighter, and moving the slider to the left makes the darker areas darker. The shadows slider works within a more targeted area, whereas the black slider will adjust the entire image. Decreasing the shadows 100% will not create as much pure black in your image as decreasing the black point 100%. After setting my white point and black point, I'm going to adjust the highlights and the shadows, and this slider is really done very much to taste, depending on what you like in your image. So I'm just going to take this highlight slider and I'm going to pull it down to bring some detail back into that sky. And I actually like the highlights at -100 in this image. It just brings so much nice color and detail back in the sky. and in the highlights of the mountains. The shadows, I like to have some shadows in my image, but I do find them a bit too dark in this one, so I'm just going to bring them up to a point where it's visually pleasing to me. Now 100 makes it look a little too washed out, so I'm going to bring it back down, maybe to around 70 or so. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good right there. Saturation adjusts the intensity of the colors in an image across the entire image equally. Use the saturation slider when you want to make a significant effect to all of the colors in your image. Vibrance will affect the saturation of colors. It works differently than saturation in that it works more selectively. Vibrance will have a unique effect on each image, affecting different areas based on the original saturation. It avoids oversaturating pixels that are already saturated and oversaturating skin tones in your image. I would suggest adjusting vibrance first to see if it will accomplish what you're looking for before trying saturation. So at this point, we've adjusted the exposure, the whites, the blacks, the highlights, and the shadows. The only thing really left might be a little bit of vibrance. I tend to avoid saturation because it's not a selective tool and can so easily be overdone. And even with vibrance, I'm very reserved. Maybe putting it at about 5 would be enough for this image. And then I take a look at the image and I decide if it's exactly where I want it to be. And looking at it now, I'm thinking that when I decreased the highlights, it made the brights in the image a little too dark. So I'm going to increase the exposure and see if that will fix the entire image and put it where I want it to be. As I do this, I'm going to be careful not to blow out any of the highlights again by watching my histogram and this little triangle. So it looks like I can bring it up a little bit more. And then I can readjust the highlights, the shadows, if the shadows need to come down a little bit now that I've brightened it. And I can press Alt and recheck my whites. I definitely want a white point there just below blowing them out. And my black points, by bringing up the exposure, I lost most of my black points. I'll bring that back. So there we are. I think that's more of what I was wanting to accomplish with my raw edit. And the raw edit is complete. The contrast slider adjusts the bright and dark parts of an image in relation to each other. Increasing contrast causes the darker areas to become darker and the bright areas to become brighter. Decreasing contrast causes the image to become more gray and the colors to become less sharp. Clarity affects the contrast of midtone luminance values. In other words, it changes the contrast of areas in the image that are not highlights or shadows. Increasing clarity adjusts the bright areas of the midtones brighter and the dark areas of the midtones darker. The texture slider falls somewhere between clarity and sharpening. It is much less harsh than clarity and offers more subtle results without affecting absolute brightness or color saturation. Dehaze can reduce or add haze to an image. The dehaze effect works by increasing or decreasing the contrast and saturation only in areas where the image appears flat. Dehaze targets the middle grays of an image. This adds contrast to those middle areas of an image without crushing the blacks or blowing out the highlights, which can happen when you use the contrast tool. Use it on images that have fog or haze that detracts from the image rather than enhances it. So the raw developing of this image is complete, but I know there are probably some of you out there who would like to finish your post-processing in Lightroom. Now for step 2, which would be exposure blending, this image doesn't really require it, and Lightroom is not very capable at doing exposure blending, so we cannot cover that in this video. But you could enhance the image using some contrast or detail or texture or some color changes if you wanted to. So first of all, let's take a look at how we would adjust color in Adobe Lightroom. You could check this part here and choose some of the color profiles and decide if one of those would enhance the image and use it. It even has some choices for black and white if that's what you like. This one makes it look very retro, almost like an old photograph from a film camera. I tend to like it just with Adobe Color, so I'm going to leave it there. But that is how you could adjust some of the colors. You can use the slider to adjust them up or down, or just choose the black and whites if you want. The next thing that you could do is possibly add some contrast using the contrast slider. When I slide this contrast up on this image, I find that it is too strong of an effect, and I'm not really a fan of it, so I'm going to put it back to 0. The texture slider, if we move that up and down, you can kind of see how it affects the image. Again, I think it's a little too much for this image, so I'm going to put it back down. I think it's too much because it adds sharpening, which I don't think this image needs much more sharpening than Adobe already added to it automatically. Clarity slider, let's see what it does. Okay, you definitely don't want to add too much, but maybe a little bit of clarity would be okay. Maybe about a 7. Let's see. Yeah, maybe about 7 to 10. If I zoom in, I can kind of see how it affects the water here, which I don't want it to bring out all of the softness in the water and take that away, so maybe I'll just add about 7. It does seem to help the mountains look a little bit more defined by adding a little bit. So 7 to 10 maybe. I think that will work. Now the dehaze slider, I'm going to move it around just to show you what it does. You can see how it adds contrast and saturation when you use it, or if you take it away, it makes it look more hazy. So if you wanted to add haze, decreasing the haze slider would definitely work. But I don't believe this image needs it. So the next step would be sharpening and noise reduction. And that would be the last step in your post-processing. So that's under the detail slider. And I tend to zoom into 100% when I do this just to kind of see where it might need some sharpening or noise reduction. If you go into 200%, you can definitely see some noise in the sky. It looks a little bit grainy. Tend not to try and do too much at that magnification because you can overdo it pretty easy. So let's take a look at adding some sharpening. Adobe already adds 40 sharpening to these raw files when it brings it in. It just takes a look at the camera profile, and it usually is pretty good at deciding how much sharpening is required. Definitely noise reduction might be a good thing. So using the luminance slider, if you bring that up, you will see how it takes away all that texture in the sky, and all those little dots are gone. Now in doing that, we may have created a bit too of a soft of the mountains, and we might need to up this sharpening a little bit more. As a general rule, it's not a hard and fast rule, but as a general rule, you want these two numbers, the amount of sharpening and the amount of luminance, to be close to 100. If you use much more than these two adding up to 100, you've probably overdone something. And there we are. We have sharpened and removed some noise. Now this particular image, if I was going to finish it off here, I would probably crop it. And that's something that again is done to taste. I would probably get rid of a lot of this unnecessary stuff at the bottom and the sides. Try and simplify the composition a little bit without so many distracting elements. Now within Lightroom, if you press the O key, it will cycle through some different options for helping you with cropping and composition. Now, as much as I'd like to get rid of all of these branches on the side, I don't believe it works very well. If I go up too far here, and I like to sometimes put the horizon line on the bottom, it makes this too heavy, and I don't like the way it's cropping off the branches. Originally, I chose these branches because I thought it was kind of a leading line into the mountains. So we want a little bit of them. Maybe we don't quite need quite that much sky, even though it is a beautiful sky. Just kind of do what you think works for your image. And that's probably where I would crop it. Now I would consider this image finished. Just to give you an idea of how much of a change the raw edit made to this image, this is the unedited raw image. And this is how the image turned out after the raw processing. Thank you for watching, and I hope that this video has helped you with your raw editing of your images.